Welcome to the Invisible India podcast. I'm Jessica.
And I'm Abhishek. We are a cross-cultural couple doing life in India, exploring the lesser-known mysteries of Indian culture,
interviewing fascinating figures who have chartered new territories, and sharing life as we raise our multicultural family amongst the complexities of modern Indian life. Today I have with me Ajay Verghese. He is an assistant professor of political science at the University of California Riverside, and he has done his PhD focusing on India and various aspects of religion, different communities within India. We are going to have him talk a little bit more about himself and his research today. Hey, how you doing?
Hey, I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, for sure. I'm super glad to have you on. So we met you here in Bihar, which is kind of an odd place to find a person like you, a learned person like you who's wanting to do research. It's sometimes you would expect people to be in larger cities or more well-known kind of political hotspots. So it was really refreshing when we met you and knew that you were focusing some of your research in Bihar. I think you first met Abhishek in a coffee shop. Is that right?
Yeah, well, I was going to say it's, in one sense, it's unusual maybe meeting in Bihar, but in the other sense, Abhishek and I met at Cafe Coffee Day, and that is not unusual at all. That's a very Indian story, I think. So, yeah, I think it was the fact that we were both using Apple laptops that initially brought us together, and then we quickly became friends.
Cafe Coffee Day. And now I think we have a lot better coffee shops than Cafe Coffee Day, but back a couple of years ago when we met you, that was the only choice we had. So
yeah, that's true. That's true. Yeah, I always remember, especially we went and then picked up your son from school, and I had known Abhishek for like an hour, and he was like, your son was like, "Who's this guy?" And he was like, "Oh, this is Ajay, uncle." And I was like, this is such a great thing about India that like it takes 1 hour and you're someone's uncle, and you're riding on a scooter with them, and it's like such a great story.
You are an Indian American, which I find to be so fascinating that you've kind of dug into your roots a bit, and where I find that a lot of Indian Americans kind of run away from anything having to do with India. So,
yeah.
And here you are. You've learned Hindi, which is not even the language that you grew up having much familiarity with. So how did you end up here?
The interesting thing is, I think if you had met me when I was like 16 or so, I definitely fit the bill of an Indian American who was running away from India. I had really like no interest in India. Our family, didn't even really visit that often. I probably would never have anticipated actually going back to India. But then I went to graduate school, and even then I initially didn't want to focus on, I wanted to be a professor. That's what I always wanted to be. But I was more focused on like European politics, or I had some interest in North Africa. I'd studied French. I didn't know any Indian languages. And what happened was I got to grad school and I realized that kind of the countries I wanted to study and the things I wanted to study were really already quite saturated. And there were just so many smart people working on that part of the world. And India was just super understudied, at least in comparison. I guess it was serendipitous that I started to think about, well, maybe this is a way I can learn a little bit more about India. And then, when I was thinking about what languages to study, probably the easiest language would have been Malayalam, which I know a little bit of Malayalam, and I can just kind of barely get by and can understand a good deal. But I thought that gives me access really to one state, and learning Hindi gives me access to a lot of states. And so when I decided to study Hindi and told my parents that I was going to study it, they were so confused and shocked that I would ever want to learn Hindi. So yeah, it was really it was not planned out. So this is very much coincidental that I ended up doing what I do and ended up in Bihar.
I think that's a lot of people's story. But I know that's part of our story too, is how did I end up, back here? Or sometimes we still ask ourselves that question. Right?
Yeah.
So I want to hear a little bit more about you and diving a little bit into your research before we get into the nitty gritty. Besides India being a less saturated area of study, what were some of your initial questions or research ideas that you wanted to dig into?
I was always really interested in history, kind of more specifically historical legacies, the history of India. I mean, what can you say? It's just endless, right?
Yeah.
When I was thinking about doing a PhD, I almost did a history PhD, but then I thought that I could do more kind of political history. And so I did a political science PhD instead. But I was always interested in history. And when I started learning Hindi, it was actually in Jaipur in Rajasthan, which is like all we learned about was the history of these antique states and these Rajput states. And so it immediately kind of meshed with my research interests. At the time that I was like first in graduate school, there were just a number of really good books that came out about Indian politics, specifically like Hindu-Muslim conflict. And so I noticed that a lot of these books were very much focused on post-independence, what happened in India in the 60s and 80s, and then with the Babri Masjid stuff in the early 90s.
Yes.
And so I thought, well, let's take a kind of a deeper look and see how colonialism influenced these conflicts. And so that's really how I started.
I see. And so that eventually became your dissertation or formed your dissertation. So can you tell us a little bit about your dissertation and how that became your first book?
Yeah. So the dissertation basically grew out of my interest in ethnic conflict and trying to understand how colonialism had affected ethnic conflict. And so, the kind of simple answer is the basic thing that I heard from everyone was, these conflicts didn't really exist until the British came to India. So I remember, one of the kind of earliest conversations I had with somebody in India, he's, when I said I was interested in ethnic violence, he said, well, that's all the fault of the Britishers. And that was just kind of his take. And so I thought, well, that's like the easy answer. And that could very well be true, but that's something that we haven't really proven. It's hard to prove that because what's the comparison? I mean, you'd have to compare like India before the British came and then after. And so people were, I think, just kind of jumping to the assumption that British colonialism had this effect that we could really measure. Right. And so what I wanted to do, especially because I was living in Jaipur, which was a former princely state, and then one day actually on a field trip in our Hindi class, we went to Ajmer, and it was the only British province in Rajasthan, and it was neighboring to Jaipur. And so I thought, what could we learn by just kind of comparing an area that was under the direct rule of the British with an area that, I won't say that Jaipur was independent, but because obviously all of the princely states still had a lot of, British influence, but it was a comparison of an area that was colonial versus an area that was much less colonial. And so I started to kind of structure my research around these comparisons. A second one is North and South Kerala. North Kerala was under the control of the British, and most of the South was princely. And so I started making these comparisons of these case studies, and then I had collected data and you did a statistical analysis of India. And so kind of what I found was that if you look at areas of India today, areas that were under the control of the British, they have more caste and tribal conflict. You would have more, atrocities committed against untouchables. You have more Maoist, the Naxalite conflict is higher in British areas. But what really surprised me was that religious conflict was lower in these areas, which is really kind of unexpected because everyone thinks of Hindu-Muslim conflict as a legacy of British rule. And so I made this argument about various what kinds of violence did we see in India before the British came, and then how did British colonialism shape and change these conflicts. And so the kind of main finding is that there's not really one effect. It's really more of a mixed effect. British rule increased some kinds of violence, decreased other forms of violence. And so I think anyone who tells you a very simple story about colonialism and ethnic violence in India is that's going to lack a lot of nuance. I think it's a much more complicated story than people think.
Yeah, to quote your Twitter, say some blame the British for all ethnic violence in India. Some absolve them for all of it. I split the difference in my book.
That's right. Yeah.
Sounds
so
fair.
The book has something to annoy everybody. Let's put it that way.
Sounds like a perfect read. Right. Do you feel like this is an excuse that's used by majority of people that you talk to about ethnic violence, or does it kind of pop up in more communities than others?
I think that, I mean, it seemed to be pretty a pretty common response that I heard from people about kind of the British, caused a lot of this violence. I think there's like a pretty strong narrative about that.
Yeah.
What's kind of interesting is that now that is changing because, in the past several decades, because of BJP governments, they have changed the textbooks that are used. And so I think now you have a deeper kind of historical perspective of when these conflicts started. But the downside of that is, of course, many of these studies that they use as textbooks have come under a lot of controversy and criticism and have some very strong anti-Muslim biases. Yeah. So I think that's probably changing to some respect. I would imagine like younger Indians think of Hindu-Muslim conflict as like a much deeper issue, which is good and bad, because I think that's true, but I think it's easy to distort what that means.
Sure. I know this is something that I hear all the time. Maybe not here in Bihar. People are expert blamers, but people don't really mean it. They don't have like reasons for this. And most of the response I find is, what can we do? There's not a lot of fuel behind it or anger behind it. It's just, things are messed up. It's the government's fault. It's this, politician's fault. It's the British fault. What can we do? Let's just slug along. That's kind of at least what I find the attitude is here in Bihar. So, which is good, but it's also bad. I think some people are too adjusted to the way things are and maybe need to fight back a little more. But I don't know. That's just my personal opinion. But
yeah. And I do think you more and more hear like these revenge narratives of like, I mean, I've heard a number of people speak with a lot of like indignation about things that happened 500 years ago that you don't even really know where your family was or how this affected you. I mean, no one knows those things. There's this idea of like history as retribution. Actually, in the Supreme Court's Ayodhya verdict just a few days ago, I think they actually... Yeah, they mentioned this. They said something like trying to right historical wrongs, by tearing down mosques and temples is not the way we should go about it. And so I think people recognize that, but I think there is this sense of like resentment that certain communities feel about the past.
For sure, most definitely. And I imagine it's different in different communities how you manipulate the masses. And here, when you have such, especially where we're at, there's such a huge population of illiterate people, and especially in a lot of the villages and even in urban areas too. So, people have no sense of what's actual news and what's fake news, and even literate people are unable to tell the difference between what's actual fact and what's fake news. So, I mean, is that something that you also see that really affects people's biases?
Yeah, I mean, so the way that the Prime Minister puts it is that, what he is on record as saying is he used the term when he was talking about kind of the history of the Hindu community in India. He said it was 1,000 years of, I think he said either slavery, or I think it was translated as like, slavery or the slave mentality, 1,000 years of the slave mentality. So when you hear, and he's an immensely popular figure. And so I think when you have lots of young boys and girls, men and women who hear this, that's they take him at his word, and they think that what he's saying is accurate. And I don't think it is accurate. And so I do think that is a very, I think they had a very concerted effort to change the narrative on how we think about the roots of violence in India today. Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about where your research is taking you now? What are you working on now?
Yeah, so the work on colonialism is basically done. I think
Right.
one thing that happens as a scholar is I spent so much time, I spent like 10 years working on that, and then you get really bored and you just
Sure.
don't want. So when someone, like, occasionally I'll get an email from a graduate student or something, they ask about colonialism, and I just like roll my eyes because I'm like, that's so
Like,
first project. I don't want to talk about that
read the
anymore.
book.
Yeah, so I think of that as basically maybe someday I'll want to write more about that, but I don't really have much interest in that anymore. So I started to get interested now much more in, still in the issue of religion, but it doesn't really have anything to do with violence. And so what actually happened was, this was like in 2010, I think. So I was still working on the first project, and I was in Madras with my mother had come to India, and we were in Madras, which is where she and my father grew up and where I was born. I was walking down the street and I saw this sign for like a local, I think they called themselves like a rationalist society or a secular society, and they were going to have a public debate about Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion. And I remember thinking, is that how many other parts of India could you even have a public discussion about that without potentially offending people? And then I wondered, is that the kind of thing that my father saw in the 60s or 70s in Madras? And so I started to think about this very old topic in political science and sociology that's called secularization. This idea that as society has become more modern, which is just another way of saying, as incomes rise and literacy rises, people in these countries tend to become less religious. That's the kind of classic theory. And so, that theory pretty much, very profitably explained Western Europe. You saw the decline of organized religion and religious views in lots of Western countries. It's more of a question about America. I think you see the rise of people who are non-religious, who call themselves nuns. They have no religious affiliation in the U.S. But so it just struck me that, first of all, this was a theory that was really kind of based in Europe and based on what I call, what scholars call the Abrahamic religions. That's Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And so I just started to think, does this actually apply to Hinduism, right? Because Hinduism is a very
religion.
Right. It's a very different religion. You need different measures. You need to think about how terms are translated. And so I remember thinking, even back in 2010, I thought, okay, once I'm done all this colonialism stuff, I'll come back to this. And so that is the book project that I've been working on for the last several years, just trying to answer that question. As India becomes a more developed country, will Hindus become less religious, as secularization theory might predict? Or a lot of people think the opposite is happening, that Hindus are becoming more religious. And so that's what for the past 2 years I've been working on. Yeah,
you're so right. In as you're looking at that question of particular case of seeing a debate, I don't, how many places would that be possible in India? And without people burning tires in the street, or is that even a goal that we're wanting to move towards? It's just an interesting measure to see, how will India interact with this idea of secularism.
Right. And so that term, I don't think even translates very well, because I think, I've surveyed a lot of Hindus. In total, the project will survey, at least starting out around 2000. And, most people don't even know. They've heard of the term secular. Even educated people in cities will say, yeah, I've heard it on the radio or I've seen it on the news, but they don't know what it means. And the one kind of example I always use is that when we think about secularization in other countries, we usually say, we usually use two main measures. We say, do people believe in God, and do they go to church or mosque or synagogue? Right. And in Hinduism, you don't have to do either of those things.
Right.
You don't have to believe
exactly.
Yeah, you don't have to believe in God. You don't ever have to go to a temple if you don't want to. Most people have puja shelves at home. So so those measures just don't translate. And so I had to spend a lot of time just thinking about how would we measure religiosity in such a different kind of tradition?
Sure. It's almost as if, there's in the dharmic religions, if you even want to call them religions, right? It's just more of a way of life or something that you're just born into. And it's interesting how as we just see how things become a little more polarized or as things become a little more defined, I don't even know when people started calling themselves Hindus, where did that term come from? We have their theories of, the Indus Valley and, anyone that basically wasn't a Muslim, they started calling a Hindu, all of these things that we hear. But now there seems to be a little bit more of a formed idea of what that means. But yeah, really anyone, if you're born a Hindu, that's what you are. You slap a label on it. You can be religious or non-religious. You can do puja. You can not do puja. You can eat certain things. You can not eat certain things. It really doesn't, there's nothing defined or what behaviors define what that actually means.
Right. Yeah. So, and it varies, so in Bihar, you're going to have a very different set of practices and diets and, than if you just compare it with Bengal, for example, right? So yeah, and the thing you said about the way of life, I mean, that's what the Supreme Court has said about Hinduism, that it's not a religion, it's a way of life. And so, but what does that mean? I mean, you don't actually hear a lot of Hindus use that. At least, I mean, the English-speaking ones might say that, but you go to the villages and people aren't saying, well, it's a way of life. For them, it is a religion, and it's
family traditions.
Yeah, exactly. You'll hear people say it's my parampara, it's my tradition, that kind of thing. So it's suffice it. The interesting thing is when I first, before I ever came to India, before I met you guys, I was at a Carnegie workshop, and I just presented some ideas for my survey and questions about Hinduism. And I remember a few of my friends, kind of other professors, very well intentioned, they were like, "Are you sure that you want to do this topic?" They said, like, this is just trying to figure out what it means to be Hindu will take you so long, and what happens if you get too frustrated. And they were. It was like well-intentioned, but they were saying, are you really sure you want to kind of go down this path? Because studying religion and studying Hinduism especially is just very, very complicated.
Yeah. Yes, it is. It's almost like if you ask 10 Hindu people what they believe, you'll get 10 different answers. It's not even about belief.
That's right. Probably 11 or 12 different answers, but yeah,
right.
That's right.
That is exactly right. Yes, perfect example. So also from your Twitter, you mentioned, it's going to be very tedious in my second book when I write this sentence every other page as you're defining dharma. Dharma, translation, religion, law, duty, norm, social usage, right conduct, morality, justice, or righteousness.
Right.
This is like a perfect explanation as you're mentioning, Hinduism is often called, Sanatan Dharma, and the eternal religion, law, duty, norm, social usage, all these things. So how, people as they're talking about their way of life, often use, ye mera dharma hai, dharam nibhana hai, mujhe apna dharam nibhana hai. So they say, like, I have to, complete basically what I'm supposed to do. And how that's defined, how do you know what you're supposed to do? Well, it's often been what's been told to you directly or indirectly by your elders, your parents, those who have gone before you in your family. So, and some people who've, even strayed away from that and who are looking in different areas of spirituality, like what falls within dharam and what falls, outside of the dharam it's very complex. There are no clear-cut answers.
Yeah.
Is that a way that you often hear people describe themselves, or do people not get that philosophical?
Yeah, so first let me go back to one thing you said, this term Sanatan. You do have some people who actually describe themselves using that term. And so, those tend to be, in my experience, older men who can know that term. I think the earliest usage of that term is in the Bhagavad Gita, although it's kind of unclear what it means. But you do hear some more educated men kind of say that. But most people, when we just ask them, what is which religion are you? Kis dharm ko mante hai, we say, and they, and so they say Hindu, and then when we kind of talk to them about what that means, the number one response or the best way I can describe your average respondent in the survey is they're just kind of very confused as to why I'm there asking these questions, and they'll sometimes say things like, if I ask, so what are the things that you do, or religious activities that you do, or what are your religious beliefs? And they'll say, I believe things that Hindus believe, or they'll say, I do things that Hindus do. And so there's just a very kind of clear sense, I think, within the community of certain things, but to outsiders, they're like, why is this interesting to you? Why would you come here and ask me? They're not irritated, but they're just kind of they don't really understand the motivation. What you said was right, that like Hinduism is a pretty exclusive club. You're born into it, right? And so I could never, I guess there are issues of whether you can convert and become a Hindu, but at the very least, it's not easy, right? It's not like converting to Christianity or something. So I think there's this strong sense of this is a kind of, everyone understands certain community norms in a village or in a city or in a caste, but people outside have always kind of struggled to figure out what is actually going on in Hinduism. I think it's pretty hard for outsiders to understand.
Mm-hmm. Especially those of us that come from a more Western linear way of extracting information, or black and white kind of. If you're the more comfortable you are in the gray, the more suited you are to kind of have any barometer for understanding. And I'm not saying that I do. I'm just saying that the more and more ambiguous allow my expectations to be, the better I understand what is happening around me in a primarily Hindu culture. So, sometimes things still surprise me. A lot of times things still surprise me. Anytime that someone says, I really understand, and can explain everything about Hinduism, it's like, oh wow, you're really, don't you feel sorry for those people? It's like, oh wow, you really missed the whole point here, didn't you?
Right. Yeah.
So I'm sure you come across this all the time in your circles.
Yeah, definitely. And there was this book like written maybe like just a year or two ago. I was listening to a podcast it's called Why Buddhism is True. It's by Robert Wright. He's not, I don't think he's an academic. It was kind of more of a popular press book, but he did have this one funny line in the book where he said that so much of Buddhism was about like paradoxes, and that's true of all the kind of, Buddhism is considered an Indic religion. And so he has this great line in the book where he says, if you don't like paradoxes, then Eastern philosophy is probably not the right thing for you. And so I think what I say to my students is, there are lots of things that are neither true nor false, right? And if you can't kind of wrap your head around that, then you're not going to like learning about Hinduism. If you can let go of this idea, it's very postmodern, right? That there is like one God or one truth or whatever. If you can relax that assumption, then things will be easier to understand.
Mm-hmm. How does a person go from having this very black and white, right or wrong kind of thinking to an understanding to be able to wrap your mind around paradoxes? How did you kind of make that move, or did you have to make that move?
Yeah, so in my Politics of India and Pakistan, we have a class where we talk about Hinduism, and then in my religion or politics and religion class, we read a book about Hinduism. And yes, I think it's something that they struggle with. I always say it kind of at the beginning that this is something that you have to understand about Hinduism. There's no Bible, there's no Pope, there's no one true doctrine.
There's no five tenets, five pillars. Mm-hmm.
Exactly. And I think that there is a lot of confusion initially with students about that. But I think that once one thing that kind of helps is like some of the mythological stories, which have, because there's just so many versions of each myth, right? I mean, how many versions of the Ramayana are there, right? Yeah. So once they kind of realize that there's just a kind of multiplicity of viewpoints, and each myth has so many different versions, then I think they start to kind of understand a little bit more about Hinduism. I think like for them, the hard thing is understanding like how it's actually survived this long, because in their minds, like to have a religion and to survive, you need
a text.
You need
a leader,
a text, or you need
a founder,
something like you need like a place where people can go once a week. So they don't, I think, understand exactly. And it's a good question, how a religion like that's so decentralized and so open to different viewpoints has survived. So I think that's maybe the harder question for them.
Sure. I've heard a lot of different scholars and whatnot say there is no Hinduism, there's Hinduisms.
Right.
And we can say that about some other faiths too, but that's not what we're talking about on this podcast. So, but I think, how a Telugu Brahmin would live their life would look very different from a village Bihari person. What their bhakti, what their dharam, what their lifestyle looks like would be. And Kirak would even say that those people are, part of the same religion. Maybe they both like Krishna, but maybe that's the end of, some kind of good feelings when they hear the stories about, baby Krishna or adult Krishna and the different mythologies there. But that might be one of the only similarities about where their daily life looks. So it's super
complicated.
Yes. Yeah. Anyone that thinks otherwise is.
Sometimes when I see people do like a survey and they come in and they're in an Indian city for like 10 days, I think how, like what could you ever learn about a place in 10 days? So spend time learning languages.
I think for me, part of and I'm not saying that I'm any expert by any means, but I think just really living in the culture, the only way I've really been able to wrap my mind around, or even begin to wrap my mind around what Hinduism or Hinduisms is becoming, was maybe in the future, having friendships and relationships with people that would identify as Hindu, and a variety of different people, not just one area. So I used to live in Haridwar, which is a very kind of like high caste Brahmin, very vegetarian, very religious kind of place. And that was one view. And then, of course, being married to a Bihari, now that's another deep dive on a very different side of even North India and even Hindi-speaking North India. And there's the exposure that I've had is just such a fraction of what's out there, but it's just been so rich, and even understanding how people's how Hinduism or Hinduisms has survived. It's incredible. I think this is just one of the lesser understood cocktail of philosophies or cocktail of lifestyles. And so I'm so glad that you're really dedicating your life to understanding and digging into this.
And I guess one thing that I would hope is, just because we don't have, very often what we do, or what scholars do, is just take questions from other traditions and ask them of Hindus. So I've tried to develop some different kinds of questions. And if you get a large enough number of respondents, it would be kind of, I would think of it, there are just so many people who do ethnography, people in religious studies or anthropology. And so I would see this as kind of a complement to that, because they're not doing surveys, right? They're going to a village or they're going to a neighborhood and living there for a long time and having daily interactions with people. But I think, what I hope my book at some point would add to the conversation is, here are context-specific questions on Hinduism, and let's see what 2,000, or maybe someday if I can expand the survey, 5 or 10,000 Hindus think about these issues, and then maybe we can get more of an insight into the Hindu worldview or the way of life, or whatever you want to call it.
Well, I feel like we're just getting started, but I feel like we need to have a part 2 with you, with Abhishek on here. Yeah. All right. So I want to ask you kind of a closing question. So what are some of the ways that you've personally been changed as you dig through the layers of what India has to teach us?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, so I mean, one kind of thing that I always try to think about is, just how privileged I've been in my life. I mean, first of all, to have grown up in a middle class, family that was able to go to America. I mean, my parents came to the U.S. They wanted us to have, go to American schools, and they wanted to start a new life there in a country that is a very, poor country, a country that still is lacking, basic infrastructure in a lot of places. And of course, this is the case in Bihar, that I've been incredibly lucky in my life, and I'm incredibly privileged to have the opportunity to come back to India and to learn from people and have a job where this is, something that I get to do. And so I always try to kind of remember that that's a privilege, and also like a responsibility to get things right, to come here. And if I just came to India and did a lot of research on Hinduism where I spoke to Brahmin men, then I wouldn't be taking that seriously,
Sure.
So that's one thing, I think, just feeling grateful about my own life. And then also, another thing is just because Hinduism is such a, like you said, a religion, everything depends on who you're talking to. Just trying to, I mean, it makes you kind of problematize a lot of the things that you thought you knew about things outside of Hinduism. Like, you just always kind of question, well, here's a perspective that I had on something, but really I only got the views of men, or I only got the views of people who are wealthy. And if you spend a little bit of time talking to somebody else, you'll get a totally different perspective. I would say in general, like India helped me, especially because I first came here as a very kind of green graduate student, helped me realize I was not as smart as I thought I was. And so that's something that's probably good for most academics to remember, that there's a lot of stuff you don't know. And so I'm trying to kind of like revel in the fact that there are lots of things I don't know, and that I can just sit with people and have chai, and people are like, the response rate for some of these surveys is like over 90%. I mean, people welcome me into their home. They have no idea who I am. They hear this Hindi with like a American accent, and they're totally willing to spend an hour or an hour and a half chatting with me about the way they see the world. And that's super exciting. And you learn something with literally every interview, every survey that I do, I learn something. So that's a really amazing feeling.
So where can people find out more about you and your work? Twitter is one place.
Yeah. My name, Ajay Verghese. I tweet about a lot of research and fieldwork photos and stuff. I have a social science research network, So if you just type in my name, SSRN, there are some articles of mine that are posted, even like working papers.
Okay, great.
And then I have a Google site where we will have published papers, and there's also data on there. So data I collected, I try to make that publicly available. So at some point in the future, there will be a data set of 2,000 Hindus and their views on religion. So if you want to dig through that at some point, it will be up there.
And I can put these links in the show notes as well.
Great.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me. I would love to do another episode with you and dig more into this at some point. Yeah. But for now, thank you. And I hope that you stay warm where you're at all the way in Vermont. Really appreciate what you're doing and uncovering some of these undiscovered mysteries. This is worthwhile work.
Thanks so much for having me.